Welcome to our ND Community Podcast. I'm Catherine and I'm a mother to 3 autistic ADHD daughters.
My name is Lorna and I'm a mother to an autistic son. We are going to be exploring stories and resources around lived ND experiences here in Guernsey.
Today we're talking to Catherine. Catherine is the chair of the Guernsey Disability Alliance and the Guernsey branch of the National Autistic Society. We'll be talking about what you need to be aware of legally if you're thinking about home educating. So welcome, Catherine.
Thank you.
Can you give us a bit of background about where you are now and what led you there?
Well, my original career background was in nursing. I got married, had my first child, who we realised by the time he was about 3, was not developing on a typical path, which led eventually to diagnosis of autism. And my second son also diagnosed autistic. So it's been a long journey, and along the way obviously had to, on my own behalf, look into the rights and responsibilities of both parents and education department. And my eldest was home educated from the age of 7 to 12, and my middle child was educated from 5 to 12, primary level, because at the time I just felt there simply wasn't the specialist support available for their autism.
So I think a lot of parents will be in the same situation as you found yourself in.
Even though that's many years ago, it's interesting to see what has changed from there to now, and probably not a huge amount, to be fair. But I think it's interesting to kind of ask questions like, what would a parent need to do if they felt like the education system here in Guernsey wasn't working for their children?
Yes, I think it's just worth referencing the child's rights. So everyone has the right to education under Article 26 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages, and elementary education shall be compulsory.
What's the definition of education?
It should be directed to the full development of the human personality. Section 3 is parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that should be given to their children. So that summarises the kind of human rights aspect of that a child has a right to an education. Most jurisdictions now in the world have some compulsory education at primary level. In Guernsey, education is compulsory from the age of 5 to 16. That article of the Human Rights Act is very much taken into account, even though our education law dates right back to 1970. And I'll quote directly from the 1970 law: "It shall be the duty of the parent of every child of compulsory school age to cause him to receive efficient, full-time education suitable to his age, ability and aptitude." And from an amendment, "and to any special educational needs he may have, either by regular attendance at school or otherwise."
And what do they mean by otherwise?
Otherwise is not defined in law. But what it does mean is that education does not necessarily have to take place in school. Now, the vast majority of people do delegate the responsibility for educating their children to the education system or to a private provider. So, for example, to Elizabeth College or Ladies College or Blancheland. And the independent schools do have some oversight from the education department, so they have to work within certain parameters. So it is the parent's duty to ensure their child gets an education. It is not a duty that they must send their child to school. The education department, however, has a responsibility to ensure that all children of compulsory school age are in receipt of some form of suitable education.
And you talk about suitable education. How do you determine whether something is suitable?
That is where the problems occur, because suitable is not defined in law. And because efficient full-time education suitable to the age, ability and aptitude and special educational needs of any individual child is very individual to the child.
Yeah.
So one of the difficulties the education department have is they cannot prescribe precisely how home educators provide an education.
Yeah.
On the other hand, parents do have a duty to provide some evidence that they are endeavouring to meet the individual needs of their child.
Yeah.
What does that evidence look like?
It can look like whatever is negotiated between those parents and the education department. The education department can give recommendations of the kinds of things they might like to see. They can't prescribe it. It will depend on the age of your child and how you embark on home education. So if you're following a kind of very child-led approach with lots of free play and child-centred choices, then you would need to explain your philosophy of education to the education department. And perhaps in that case, the evidence you would provide would be in the form of something more like a diary, recording the kinds of activities your child is engaged in, what you feel that they're learning out of that. To try and put it in a perspective for, say, a primary age child, you might make a cake with your child. In that, you can be using a recipe, literacy, measuring and weighing, maths, the changing state of the mixing these ingredients together, putting them in the oven, applying heat, primary science. So just baking a cake, it can become all of those things without making it seem like a lesson. You're just introducing these things naturally. Whereas in a school setting, it is much more formalised.
Yeah.
It's a difficult concept for parents embarking on home education because they often feel they have to do school at home.
I think there's a certain amount of parental unschooling that has to happen as well as child unschooling. You know, if we've been through the education system, that's what we know and that's what we've been brought up to believe is the avenue to success.
Yeah. Mass compulsory schooling is a 19th century concept. So
if your child is in school,
yes,
and like many in our community is struggling to regulate at school, or the provision isn't what the parents are hoping for, or more support is needed, how do they go about challenging that or changing it?
In the first instance, at a primary school, you would go to your class teacher and discuss your concerns. Then at the secondary level, because there are a lot of teachers involved, you might speak to the head of year. But in both cases, you would probably, particularly if you feel your child has additional needs or has severe anxiety or any other issues around school, if your starting point is to try and make school work, then you would make an appointment to see the SENCO, now renamed the Additional Learning Needs Coordinator. These people have additional qualifications on top of their teaching in supporting children with special educational needs, additional learning needs. And there are various things that schools can do within the school itself to try and provide additional support.
And is this with or without a diagnosis? So if a child, so we know in Guernsey at the moment it's taking a long time. It's gotten a lot better than what it has been, but it takes a long time to get a diagnosis. So would parents be able to approach the SENCO or the class teacher regardless of whether they had a diagnosis or a determination of need in place?
Absolutely.
Is that still an option?
Absolutely. You do not require a diagnosis of any specific condition to have special educational needs or additional learning needs. In fact, it is often the SENCO that is the first person who really starts to identify what those additional needs might be. And in many cases, they identify those issues and approach the parents. It can be the other way around. The problem for the school is the system of obtaining additional assessments, diagnostic assessments, can be very slow. A term, as is stressed, a child missing, dropping below 90% attendance is impacting on their education. So a child who's got problems with they're not able to access the classroom, they're struggling in school, they're missing school, it is going to impact on their education. So yes, schools absolutely can and do put intervention in place before a diagnosis is given of
But
anything.
how easy is it for school to put an intervention in place if the major stressors are things like environment and busy classrooms?
I think it's fair to say that it is extremely difficult to impossible in some cases to actually fully support a child if they really, really can't cope with the environmental input.
What are the alternatives?
There are very limited alternatives within the state sector at the moment. There are the autism bases. Again, there are limited places. There are other non-autism specific sort of safe spaces in some of the secondary schools.
And just to be clear, when we talk about schools, we're not talking about the special needs schools, because that's already in place to a huge degree. So we're talking about the mainstream schools.
If a school is not able to accommodate a child's needs, that is where full formal assessment would be required with a view to a specialist placement. Unfortunately, because we're a small community, the scope of our specialist placements are limited. Levoix does an excellent job, but it's got limited places and has a very mixed cohort, so may not be suitable. And Levoix offers a mainstream curriculum.
Yeah.
Whereas Le Maurier offers a very supportive environment, but it doesn't offer a mainstream curriculum. It offers a modified special needs curriculum.
My guess is because of its proximity to St Sampson's High, there is some ability for the kids to go into it, but then they've got the environmental issue as well.
Yes. Theoretically, the co-location was supposed to facilitate that flexibility. But in practice, it is quite challenging because you've got timetabling differences and you've got a situation where a child might well be able to access a GCSE, but not in a mainstream classroom because of their sensory processing issues, their heightened anxiety and whatever. So, and I think, the education department are fully aware of this and they are taking steps as much as they can to attempt to address the issues. But with the best will in the world, I think some children simply find school just too overwhelming.
Is that children that are attending mainstream schools who are capable from an educational point of view? So they want to learn, they're capable of learning, but it's the environment that seems to be causing such high levels of anxiety and trauma that they literally can't even make it into the school building some days.
I think, yes, that is true of some children. It's a difficult conundrum because, in principle, I am in favour of fully inclusive education. But the problem is we have to have some degree of economies of scale.
Yeah.
We have to have schools that can accommodate the majority. Because, to give an example, my eldest son went to an independent school in the UK. He's diagnosed autistic. He had some minor special educational needs, and he was never in a class of more than 13 students his entire secondary career. He didn't actually need any special intervention in that school. It was a school that was very knowledgeable and supportive of autism. It is obviously much more expensive to deliver that kind of education provision. On the other hand, it's expensive not to, because you'll find that children are then falling out of school and not reaching their potential.
And actually maybe therefore drawing on our social security benefits rather than,
Well, it's not just children though, is it? It's the parents as well.
Yes.
Because when you take your child out of school, if that no longer becomes an option for you, it usually means one of the parents, potentially even both of the parents, will have to give up working or working in some capacity, which then has an impact on their income, which then has an impact on what they can provide.
The education system, although it says it is in the law that a child should be educated in accordance with the parents' wishes, as long as this does not incur unreasonable expenditure. So, of course, that is where the issue around all the processes that the education department have on assessing needs, it isn't what the parent thinks the child needs, it's around what is affordable and reasonable to provide in the situation.
So within that kind of parameter, if you have a child who really isn't coping at school and you feel a different provider would suit their needs better, is there any way of asking whether they can move or?
Yes, I think there is a limited amount of flexibility within the system. There have been cases of where a child has been moved from one of the larger secondary schools to one of the smaller ones historically, simply because the environment has been less challenging for them. So a case can be made if you're working with a SENCO and the school are putting in various support systems within the resources available, and you really feel that this is not working. You do, as a parent, have the right to request a full special educational needs review with a view to determination. However, the decision as to whether to grant that request does still rest with the education department. So they will consider it, but...
And if they say no, do you have any recourse?
I don't believe you do, no. There is a panel, a complex needs panel, I believe it's called, that will review off-island provision for specific cases where the child's needs cannot be met on island. This is increasingly rare now because the special needs schools are geared up to support quite a range of need. Referral to the complex needs panel would usually be in a case where there are severe and significant complex needs, both medically and cognitively, or where there is a forensic need, so a child that needs to go into secure care.
So if a parent has gone through all the steps that they need to go through in a mainstream situation and their child doesn't get a place, for example, at a special needs school, and they still feel that it's not meeting the needs for their child is maybe starting to show signs of trauma, high anxiety, shutting down, just not being able to cope with the school environment, how would a parent go about taking their child out of school and potentially home educating?
The legal steps are that if you reach that decision, I would personally advise any parent to discuss it with other home educators. There's a home educating support group on social media. Give real thought to how it's going to impact on your family life and income and all of those things. But having come to the decision that you really feel that home education is the best option for your child, then you need to inform the school that you have made that decision, and you need to inform the education department that you have made that decision and request that your child be removed from the school role. At that point, you are at liberty to commence home educating.
So you don't have to ask permission or anything, you can just say this is what we're intending to do and then go ahead, in writing, presumably.
Yes.
Do you have to give reasons? Do you have to say, this is the reason why I'm deregistering my child from education, or you don't need to give reasons?
No, you don't need to give reasons. There's no legal obligation to justify your choice. You can choose to home educate for philosophical reasons, simply because you don't believe that mass education is the right approach and that you want a more tailored approach for your child, regardless of whether your child has any additional needs or not. No, you do not have to justify your reasons. There is an additional rule that was passed by the states that is an additional to the educational law. It's a directive that schools should keep a child on the roll until the education department is satisfied that the parent is providing an adequate education. Now, you cannot prove that your child is in receipt of an adequate education if you haven't actually been allowed to commence home education. So that is an administrative issue for the education department. If they wish to retain the child on the roll, that's up to them, but they shouldn't be marking your child as unauthorised absence, because you have given the official notification that henceforth you will be taking full responsibility for your child's. You have deregistered your child. You're not legally obliged to send your child to school, so you don't have to register your child with the school when they're 5. The education department, a policy that parents should register that their child is going to be home educated, which is, I think, a fair thing for parents to do, because the education department do have a responsibility to ensure that parents are home educated. It's a responsibility to your child. You know, it's a duty that is imposed on them by law. I see no reason why any parent would not wish to inform them. But I don't think at this precise moment there is a legal obligation to do so. It's the education department policy.
And am I right that there's also no legal obligation to sit any GCSEs or A-levels or anything? They may decide that that would be the way forward for future employment, you know, for especially maths and English, or functional maths and English.
No, there's no legal obligation that all children in school take GCSEs, because many of them don't.
Yeah.
And some take reduced numbers of GCSEs. So no, there is no obligation to take part in any of the kind of target meeting or exam processes. Obviously, most parents do want their children to do well academically, access employment, whatever. But the limitations of the school system is that you're inevitably locked into ages and stages. So you take your GCSEs at 16. If you are home educated, you can take a GCSE at 14, 15, 16, 18, 20, whenever you are ready to take your GCSEs. By doing it that way, there is often a financial implication. Whereas if your child is in school, the GCSE curriculum is delivered free of charge to you, at point of delivery, and there is no charge for the examinations. Once you take full responsibility for your child's education, you're essentially deemed to be educating privately.
So that's really difficult, isn't it, for a parent who you're looking at a really distressed child potentially, a reduced income, and then a huge burden because they're not cheap.
Yeah, it can work out very expensive to do a full 9 GCSEs privately is quite expensive, which is another reason why parents often stagger them, because they simply can't afford to do 9 at once.
So that's quite a melting pot of stress.
There are a lot of factors to consider, and one of the big ones is economic. It will put additional economic strain on the system. But for many parents, they're already at breaking point, and it can be the only answer. For others, it's more of a philosophical choice. They just feel that their child would benefit from a more tailored approach, not that they have to do it.
Especially if they have a special interest, which a lot of neurodivergent children do. They have a particular interest in a field, and everything else just doesn't maintain it. And so it's a fantastic, opportunity for them to really just absorb that interest.
And in full disclosure to our listeners, we home educated 2 of ours, and it was a massive hit financially. However, as a family as a whole, our stress level was massively reduced because our children were not distressed day in, day out. And all our education was around arts and crafts and things, and that's how we learned.
And your daughter is now a jewellery maker.
She is now a jeweler.
It all kind of worked out the way it should have, the way you wanted it to, and she wanted it to.
But it wasn't without its stresses.
A point that is quite contentious and difficult for home educators whose children do require input from, say, HSC services, is that some of those services go into school, not delivered to the individual child. But theoretically, your child is still entitled to it because it's a health provision, not an education provision. So, again, that's another grey area where it can be challenging.
Do you have any idea how many children in Guernsey are home educated? Do you have any figures?
I don't know. No, the education department will have figures. The home educating support group will have a good idea because quite a number of people do join that support group, and a lot of people join the social media support page simply to find out more. They're considering it, so rather than just getting the official line from the education department or school, they want to talk to people who are doing it, experienced it, or have experienced it, whatever. It's fair to point out that some of the information on the education department's website is inaccurate, and they are aware of that, and it is under review. So it is probably best, if you have questions to ask of the Education Department themselves, to speak directly to the Home Educating Support Team, told by home educators that they are extremely supportive. Things like you don't actually have to have meetings at your own home. In some instances, a child who has been very stressed by school don't want anything to do with education initially, so it may be appropriate to have an initial meeting at a neutral meeting place.
Could be in the library.
It could be, and I believe that the team will accommodate that. Generally, most home educators are perfectly happy to welcome the education team into their home. That's the most convenient. That's where the child is. But the Education Department is a little bit misleading of them to be judging the home environment as the home education environment, because of course home educators don't just sit at home with their child at a desk working a la school. They're out and about in the community. You take your child shopping, they learn how to budget and handle change and do all things in real time, in real life, as opposed to being taught in an artificial environment in school. So lots of learning is life-based as opposed to formally taught. That's the philosophical divide between school-based education and home-based education, is that home education has the flexibility to use all sorts of different resources that is much more difficult to use when you've got 25 kids to be corralling and looking after. So parents need to have the confidence to sort of think through the types of things, instead of thinking, oh, I have to do school at home. Thinking through the types of things that their child engages with, how they can engage them in learning, particularly younger age groups. Teenagers, more secondary age children who have come out of school through traumatic reaction to school may need a kind of very low-key approach initially, that anything that kind of resembles formal school learning can be stressful. So you may need to bring back in more formal learning at a slower pace rather than simply doing it straight away at home.
With ours, we probably spent a year with each of them, just calming down their nervous system, feeding them well, getting them outside, just so that they were in a place to be able to learn again.
Those will be questions that the Educational Department would want to know what you're doing and why, but it doesn't mean it's wrong, or that they're necessarily going to say, oh, you're not providing an adequate education.
I have to say they were very supportive.
So what is the actual, when you deregister your child from school and you say you want to start the home education process, and maybe you've looked into the support groups that you mentioned online, on Facebook, etc., how often do you get formally checked by the Education Homeschooling Department? Is that twice a year, once a year, or do you work that out? Is it a case by case basis?
I think it would be on a case by case basis. I think if there are any initial concerns, it would be more often. But generally speaking, is it twice a year?
We were checked twice a year.
Twice a year.
But that was a while ago.
I believe it's twice a year. The Education Department also, not the department, the last committee, did seem to get a little bit hung up over safeguarding concerns. Now,
that's been discussed a lot in the UK recently, hasn't it, with home education?
It's a valid point, but a home educating child, their concern is that they're under the radar. Well, if they're checking twice a year, the thing is, if you have a child in school and there are safeguarding concerns about that child regarding the family, the child should already have been referred into the relevant pathways. And in that case, I mean, if there is already social work involvement, safeguarding issues, the Education Department do have a tool to put compulsion on parents for the child by issuing a compulsory school attendance order. And we have the system with the tribunal and the convener that can put compulsion on parents. So there's a whole separate system there for where there are serious safeguarding concerns. You don't keep a child in school to keep them safe.
Does that contradict what you've said before, where you said that sometimes when you take a child out of school to home educate them and they're receiving additional support at schools of speech and language, does that then contradict?
No, I'm talking about safeguarding issues here. I'm not talking
but
about...
I'm talking about the states. So if your child is at school and then you deregister take them out of school basically, the child who was getting access to support from the states, whether that's safeguarding issues or whether that's for speech and language, for example, when you deregister them from school, do they kind of fall between the gaps?
They shouldn't, because they're separate referrals. If a child is in receipt of generic support that's put into the school, so like a speech and language therapist giving general advice, they wouldn't be accessing that if they're at home. But if they have been referred directly to the speech and language therapy service, that referral still stands. That child remains on the speech and language therapy caseload. Safeguarding is a separate issue. If the child has already been referred because of safeguarding concerns, then there is a mechanism in place where compulsion can be placed on the parent to keep the child in school. But if no such system, no such concerns have been flagged up, it's not about going and doing a safeguarding assessment on the home or the parents before allowing home education, because when that child is not in school, school holidays, evenings, weekends, the parents are totally responsible for the safeguarding of their own child.
Yeah. And actually, I would suggest that for some children, school is the traumatic event, not the home life.
Yes.
So actually, there's some kind of safeguarding required the opposite way.
The 2017 policy that has this proposal that the home educating environment should be assessed for its suitability, and I have said to the education department, but I would contend that a standard classroom is not a suitable environment for many neurodivergent children, but we put them in there anyway. Yeah. So, we don't assess whether it's suitable for each individual child. No. We assume it is until it proves otherwise.
Yeah. By which time the child is already...
Yes. Yeah. So no, you don't have to have your home assessed as suitable environment. Now, obviously, if there is social work involved and that there is concerns that your home environment is unsuitable for care of your children, that is, again, a completely separate issue. Yeah. The education department have no legal right of entry. You invite the education department into your home.
Yeah. And do they provide any additional support? So, for example, if you needed help with things like science or maths, or as you said, basic English, do you get any of that support from the state's home education department if you were to ask for it?
I don't think so. No, they they don't provide any educational support. The support is...
So really, it's the groups. It's and I just wanted to bring up, so if people wanted additional support, so if they've decided, okay, I'm going to, or I am currently home educating, but I'd really love a bit more support. I'd love to know if I'm doing this right, or I'd love to know if there is more that I could have access to. Is it here in Guernsey, is that your only option? The groups that have been set up, independent groups by independent parents. Yes. That is the resource that's available.
And actually, we were really lucky because now, compared to home education 20 years ago, there's an amazing amount on the internet.
Yeah.
This is
fantastic.
The support team can advise and signpost, but they're not there to actually provide individual families with specific
resources. And one of the things we found that would have been amazing to have somebody to help with is the whole exam thing. Getting them registered, getting them into suitable access requirements. Yeah. That's a big piece of work.
Because exams in themselves is kind of like a coaching thing. It's it's more around coaching your child how to take an exam sometimes than the actual learning of the content of what could be asked in an examination, because it's a unique experience.
There is advice from the states on examination centres and fees. Anyone commencing off-island online learning, GCSE courses, it is worth checking beforehand which examination boards are available as external candidates in Guernsey. Yeah. The state schools will take, the Guernsey Institute, and I believe the private colleges do, but they're not exam centres for all exam boards, so it's worth checking. That doesn't mean you can't do GCSEs or A-levels that are not available in Guernsey, but it may mean going to a UK exam centre. So again, a huge additional expense. So it's worth looking at, because there are a lot of GCSE subjects and international GCSE subjects that are available that are not taught in local schools. But I think for a lot of parents, with much younger children, the exam issues are not really relevant. It's about broader, more general education.
So a final question from me would be, so we've talked about school and from an education point of view and learning, but if we just park that for a minute, because I find that school can also bring other benefits, such as that social interaction, that your friends, peer groups, which can be positive and negative. So I'd like to know from both of your experiences, your lived experiences, what are the pros? Taking education aside and learning aside, did you feel like your children either gained or missed out, or a bit of both, on anything other than the educational side from not attending school, from being home ed? What are the drawbacks, do you think, and what are the benefits?
For my children, they were both in burnout as well. So they desperately missed the socialisation, but they didn't have the energy to do that. So they missed the socialisation, but they also recognised that actually school was not an environment that was healthy for them, and they were too burnt out to actually do anything about that. But that did have an impact on their mental health. Yeah. We used to sit down and chat a lot, and their view was going back to school would be worse. I think it really benefited our relationship, because we saw them through their darkest times, and now they're both flourishing. Actually, they're both doing really well. And they think that had we not pulled them out of school, that burnout would have carried on for years and years. So whereas it was tough, it was the right thing for them.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a myth that children out of school don't get social opportunities.
That's true.
What they don't get is the opportunity to be with 25 other kids within a specific age range that they haven't chosen to be. The home educating support group is an excellent resource, because different parents organise different activities at different age group, different levels. Because we do now have quite a sizable home educating community, the opportunities for social. But of course, the other thing is that at school, the only time children specifically socialise, is at breaks and lunch times.
Yeah.
The social environment within a classroom is controlled by an adult. It's not about them building friendships. Yeah. They do collaborative work. More social interaction is gained from sports, that collaborative working.
There's loads.
Theatre. So a lot of the things that happen in school that you get for free. That help develop children's social and interaction and collaborative.
So
working
it might
with
be
each
a bit
others.
of a myth if people think, if I take my child who's already maybe a bit of maybe a quiet child, and they take them out of school and they think they're going to be isolated, they're going to have no friends, no opportunities to make friends.
There's lots going on, but you have to go out and find it.
Of course, yeah.
For my kids, they didn't have the capacity to do that at the time. But once they did, then the home ed group is pretty active. There'll be, on the whole, at least one other person you can meet up with regularly. Yeah. The Youth Commission, I think, run a home ed group. So there are opportunities around.
And the thing is, if your child is fairly sociable and outgoing, they will be keen to go to things. If your child is neurodivergent and is struggles with social interaction, they won't necessarily be making friends in school anyway. Being in school does not necessarily solve those social interaction problems if you have social interaction problems.
Catherine, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Yeah, I think we've got rid of some myths there around home education. I've learned a lot anyway.
Yeah.
So thanks very much.
You're welcome.
If there are people out there who are listening and either have similar experience, or if there's any success stories as well, so please by all means get in touch. We'd love to hear from you.
Just a quick shout out to EasyDo. Without EasyDo, we wouldn't be able to do this podcast. They've lent us all their tech. We're really grateful.
Thank you.